Hey everyone, greetings. It's Naomi Wolf with Substack Live and my podcast Outspoken. And today I'm going to read the essay I wrote a couple of days ago when I was in Lenox, Massachusetts. And you'll hear what it's about, but I guess the headline is "The World for Which I Passionately Trained as a graduate student, the world in which certain civilizational skills and continuities could be taken for granted no longer exists. And different threats make it less real than it used to be. And I will tell you exactly what I mean. Comment, of course, let me know your thoughts as we go along, and I will just jump right in. Letter from Lenox, a moment in the lost world. There is a gracious wooden porch through the double French doors to my left. It faces a corridor of tall old evergreens. Their dark brown bark is ragged. Beyond their solemn company stretches a slope of velvety green lawn. Sunlight slants white-yellow through the boughs of the pines, touching the grass here and there into glowing lighter green fairy patches, as if the whole scene is posing for an old-fashioned landscape painter. The porch is several feet wider across than are the porches that are built today, and I know why. This inn, now called the Constance, was originally built in 1825 as the Williams Tavern. It housed lawyers and judges as the courthouse was nearby, an outpost of civilization in what was at that time a dense wilderness stretching across the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. In the 1880s, then owner Frederick Constance Perkins moved the structure to its current location, a main street of the picturesque resort town Lenox. Perkins added late Victorian embellishments inside and out. And since I've been having trouble sharing my screen lately, I will just hold that up to the camera. The porches to my left are so wide because the ladies who sat in the rocking chairs of that hotel at that time wore skirts, excuse me, that took a great deal of management. Fashion for elegant Northeastern women called for voluminous skirts in the 1880s. The days of the crinoline were now over, but very elaborate drapery down to the ankles had replaced that belle silhouette of the decades past. The 1880s called for layers of petticoats, even daringly the single layer of a red flannel flounced petticoat among multiple layers of white cotton petticoats. The red flannel would just flash when skirts were lifted to cross muddy streets. Over all these layers cascaded overskirts, often in contrasting colors to the underskirts. People often don't know this because Victorian photography, of course, is black and white. It's shades of gray. So you can't tell. I was very surprised to learn that colors for fashionable women's clothing in the 19th century were very bright and often not even harmonizing or contrasting, but just clashing. Like they didn't have the same ideas of, acid yellow doesn't go with bright orange or deep maroon that we may have today. The other thing that led to the proliferation of all kinds of very, very, very intense color, chartreuses, hot pinks, lavenders, especially with silks, had to do with the discovery of aniline dyes. Dyes before the 19th century were vegetable-based, so there was really a limit to how many colors you could use. And also, vegetable dyes are much more muted in shades, with some exceptions like purple from, the famous priestly purple and Roman purple from the Nautilus, I believe, shell. But in the 19th century, new chemical processes led to the ability to create these kind of almost neon colored, intense colors. So I know we think of the 19th century as very subdued, very buttoned up. You've got to imagine it like, like the 1970s disco like colors, like hot pink, hot yellow, hot green, uh, bright blues, all of them kind of worn together in the case of women. Both skirting layers fell from fitted tunics. These were tailored as separate pieces too, that covered tightly corseted hips and cinched waists. All of that complex drapery was attached in turn at the rear of the skirting to cover high horsehair bustles. The drapery then descended from the bustles in flounces, which were often finished in tassels. So this was a major architecture, just getting dressed. With the ladies for whom it was built, having all of this complicated skirting and related costume architecture to manage, of course, the porch to my left had to be constructed to be wide. I know a lot about the 19th century. It was the subject of my graduate studies. I know intimately how fashionable women dressed in the 1880s. I could literally recite, what it takes to get dressed in the 1880s in my sleep without notes. And I'm not showing off. I'm going somewhere with this. I've been obsessed with Victorian fashion, literature, and culture ever since I was first conscious of history and of culture. I was 11 and living with my family in Jerusalem in 1973. This was just before the Yom Kippur War, when I first stumbled upon this period. Since I had no English books to read at home and did not yet speak or read Hebrew well, my mother would take me to the old gray stone British Council Library, a treasure trove of English books. That library system, which was international, had been established by the British Foreign Service in order to bring British culture to what had been British colonial outposts around the world. The English culture that the British Council Library had brought in the early 1970s to Jerusalem compiled and presented for readers memories of the aristocratic England of 2 to 3 generations prior. It was kind of like an Edwardian English country house or 1920s English country house library. So book-deprived preteen as I was, I spent my afternoons on the sunny limestone porch of our apartment, devouring the ephemera of 50 years of British scandal and gossip, accounts of the lives of famous prostitutes in the 19th century, novels of Edwardian country house life with its louche adulteries, its gambling, and its hunting. Like, where was my mother? Why did she think this was appropriate? And later stories in novella formats of the mad antics and silly costume parties of London's bright young things of the debauched 1920s. By the time I was 12, I knew what it meant to be ruined, too sexually experienced to find a proper husband. I mean, I knew from reading, I should make that clear, what it meant to be a second son in an aristocratic family, landless, and what it meant when respectable ladies would not acknowledge your visiting card, social death, as you were being judged a hopelessly fast female. I remember asking my mother, who was trying to cook our dinner on the primitive kerosene stove in the cramped kitchen, what a, quote, courtesan was. I actually can see why my mom, who was, busily pursuing her own graduate studies at the time, didn't kind of scrutinize these books and think, is this right for my preteen? They were very respectable biographies. And if you didn't read them through in great detail, you really wouldn't know, that the subject was these women who basically made a living as courtesans. I was especially interested in this because it became clear from my reading that the Victorian wives had constricted and tedious lives, but that the courtesans' lives were adventurous, independent, prosperous, and wild. So I inhaled the stories of the great courtesans of the late Victorian period, such as that of Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily. Langtry was the first professional beauty. She was also the first mass advertising icon, an actress as well. She was mistress of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and she was Oscar Wilde's friend and confidant. He called her the new Helen, and these are the great beauties of this period. And there's Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily. Catherine Walters, called endearingly to me Skittles, was another famous Victorian courtesan memorialized by the British Council Library. Did they really understand what books they had? Skittles had been a widely admired equestrian and style icon and reputedly had had many political leaders as lovers, or as we would say today, clients. And here is Skittles. Her figure when she rode on horseback through Hyde Park was much admired, as you can imagine. Look at that tiny waist. Cora Pearl, for her part, had been an English girl who set out for Paris to set herself up as a legendary courtesan. This goal may sound off to modern ears, but in the 19th century, well-paying jobs for single women were almost completely non-existent. High-end prostitution was one of the only ways that single women could acquire both independent lives and money of their own. So the temptation into the world of prostitution was as imaginable then to daring or reckless or immoral, depending on one's outlook, young women at that time, as would be setting out to try one's luck in Hollywood, tempted with the prospect of opening an OnlyFans account to young women today. And here is Cora Pearl, who I honestly think is one of the most beautiful young women I've ever seen. Look at that. Look at that expression. She's having none of it. Whatever it is, she's having none of it. The life of a scandalous Victorian woman that impressed me most was that of Jenny Jerome. She was not a courtesan. Rather, she was the daughter of a wealthy stockbroker, the king of Wall Street, quote unquote. As, quote, new money, this fortune was considered too vulgar to allow Jenny to marry into the American elite. So, like many young ladies similarly situated, Jenny Jerome was brought by her mother to London to seek an advantageous match among cash-poor British aristocrats. In the final years of the 19th century, many old English aristocratic families needed fresh infusions of capital to finance their opulent homes and lifestyles. Quote, new money heiresses, disdained by the matchmakers for the New York and Boston old families, needed husbands. The fascinating marketplace that these sets of requirements created for the impoverished sons of old English and European families and the daughters of American robber barons and heiresses to steel and meatpacking fortunes provided material for novelists ranging from Henry James to Edith Wharton. Jenny Jerome was a grand success in her new milieu. She, like Langtry, became a lover of the Prince of Wales, among other reputed suitors. She eventually married Randolph Churchill, the scion of the great family who were owners of the magnificent Blenheim Palace. And she became the mother of the future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The scandals of her life did not end with her marriage. Called Lady Randy, she was reputed to have had an insatiable sexual appetite and eventually to have had 200 lovers. And here is Jenny Jerome. And as I note, she's draped in that overskirt that I'm describing to you. What an expression. I mean, these women were supposed to be so kind of demure and retiring. My goodness, they looked in the camera like they were tigresses. Look at how beautiful she was. Incredible. I recap all of this because the 19th century, its personalities, manners, books, fashion, culture, crises, and joys, is my soul's imaginative dimension. I was academically trained for years, mentally to inhabit this world. I had planned to do so for the rest of my life and to explain it and share its wealth to upcoming generations. This was the civilizational task for which I had long studied. So when I found myself in that old Lenox hotel, I knew in my very bones where I was. I understood the wide entrance hall with its dimensions that allowed serving girls to carry steaming platters out from the original rear kitchen and scullery areas, workspaces that were now torn down and reconstructed into additional bedrooms. And you can see that wide hallway there. I understood that the spacious parking area had once held stables. I knew that the transoms above the doors and at the tops of the high windows, with their smaller panes separated from one another within the larger, dark wooden frames by beautiful diamond-shaped patterning, were necessary to allow cross breezes into stuffy rooms before air conditioning had been invented. And there you can see the transoms and that cross section of breezy living room. I understood the octagonal windowed bay in one corner of the gracious sitting room because it had originally been designed as a setting for women and girls to sew, or for guests of both sexes to read or play cards while seated at a round table, as it would have had to be illuminated by a single oil lamp at a time before radio or television and before there was abundant lighting after sundown. And I just find this completely fascinating, how technology dictates the way we live in our homes. This octagonal kind of I guess there would be a turret outside, uh, but this rounded corner of one of the sitting rooms had been designed that way because there weren't, abundant overhead lights. There wasn't any electrical illumination when in the mid 19th century. In the 1880s and 1890s, things began to be electrified, but even at this time, you would have had oil lamps, and so many Victorian tables, 19th century tables, are small round tables for this very reason, that in the evening there would be one oil lamp, and rather than wasting the oil by scattering lamps throughout the house, people would come sit around the one oil lamp at the round table and bring their sewing or bring their book, or someone would read aloud from a book. I just find that completely fascinating. It was actually a big part of my doctoral thesis, because I don't want to go into a rabbit hole, but my thesis was about censorship in the 19th century, and you can imagine there didn't used to be censorship law in Britain, or in America for the most part, but in the 19th century you began to have a situation in which men, heads of households, paterfamiliases, dads, would, especially in the middle and upper middle classes, would sit in the evening reading to wives, daughters, and servants. And so the racy, even classics, right, or Marquis de Sade or whatever, the adults only reading that men used to do by themselves, because their wives were not literate, right? Now they had to read novels, for instance, or travel books or other forms of nonfiction, biographies, to a mixed group, including quote unquote innocent wives and daughters and servants for whom they're supposed to be morally responsible. So you couldn't have the same. You had to have censorship. The texts, even Shakespeare, had to be Baudelairized. At least this was the rationale, that you didn't want your wife or daughter to be, inflamed, or to get shocking ideas from hearing what it was perfectly okay for you as a man, especially as an aristocratic man, to hear, discuss, read in your club or in your library, in your study. Which I just think that's so interesting, that people sitting together in a new way led to the shaping of books and the censorship of books. And my thesis was actually specifically about Walt Whitman, and how Walt Whitman, it was literally illegal to sell Leaves of Grass in Britain. And literally secret books. I love my thesis. It's so good. I'm sorry I miss this field, obviously, but literally unexpurgated copies of Leaves of Grass smuggled from America used to be handed kind of under the table or illicitly at great risk. You could lose your career, you could go to jail, to other readers, but especially this became a way for gay men. The word gay wasn't in use in the same way at that time, but homosexual men, to signal to each other that that's what they were, and it was okay to make friends or go further than that. They were part of a subculture. Leaves of Grass changed hands in this way. So interesting. And there's even false tip-ins. The booksellers would put fake kind of copyright and printing information in the frontispieces of the title pages so that they would not get in trouble for distributing it. It's so interesting. Nonetheless, people got in trouble. I mean, people really don't know the history of censorship in Britain. Maybe it's better known now that my book is out. My book has had, quite a journey. As you know, it was targeted for censorship. It was pulped and then reprinted, allegedly over a, I would say, debated interpretation of a term. But it's very interesting that I think one reason my book was targeted is that it puts the 19th century in a totally different light and shows that the British state was totally capable and willing to lock up booksellers. Booksellers up and down Britain were being locked up for up to 3 months at a time for selling indecent material, quote unquote. Could be the classics, could be Catullus, right? The Latin poet, or people who committed sodomy, wrote about sodomy, wrote poems about sodomy, which is the term in use at the time instead of homosexuality or gay, sex, which terms came much later. They were going to prison, and they risked, this is debated, but I stand by it, with the two foremost scholars of 19th century law around sodomy and literature around sodomy. They agree with me. In the early 19th century, the British state was executing men for sodomy, not the Victorian period that started in 1837, but the early 19th century. I was attacked for this. I was smeared. I was canceled. It is true. Maybe the history books don't want to acknowledge it, but it is true. And in fact, there was actually a ceremony a few years back in which the British military essentially apologized for imprisoning and sentencing so seriously men in the Navy, I believe, who were convicted of sodomy. So I was right. I can add it to the things I was right about. But moving right along, I want to just acknowledge what someone said here before I pick up again, which was something like, I'm sorry. Oh, Roscoe, that's so sweet. I'm sorry what they took from you, Dr. Wolf. I know it's a small consolation, but you're teaching me this stuff and others. That is so moving to me. Thank you, because the desire I have to teach this material is still so strong. And I still think it's so important. The 19th century is where the 21st century comes from. I mean, it was so many things that we take for granted as part of society, ranging from women voting and having property and not being raped in marriage, to the end of child labor and universal schooling, education for children. All of that began in the 19th century. It completely transformed reformers, especially, which is why it's such a beautiful, moving, also brutal and complicated century to me. But there was a great movement of reform and reformers, idealists, often Christian, driven by Christianity, who were determined to change the world, and make it better and make it conform more to kind of a Christian society in which children were not being worked to death and then sent to the poorhouse when they couldn't feed themselves, but got to go to school and became educated, in which women could own property instead of being turned out of the house when their husband died and having no alternative but being seamstresses for starvation wages or prostitutes, right? I mean, I could go on, but it is a really important period. Maybe I will teach it again someday. Maybe I'll teach it virtually. Anyway, thank you, Roscoe, and I'll pick up again. Oh, Roscoe said it was a brilliant book. It was a politically motivated witch hunt against you. Anyone who looks at your case subjectively sees that. Say strong. Muscle emoticon. Thank you, Roscoe. I'm very proud of it. The book is called Outrageous. It's based on my thesis. I understood the octagonal windowed bay in one corner of the gracious sitting room had originally been designed. Oh, yes, I read that. For women and children to sew. I explained that. Illuminated by a single oil lamp at a time before radio or television and before there was abundant lighting after sundown. I knew that there were no original closets in my high, sage-walled bedroom that faced the village green, because people in the 19th century usually kept their clothing in freestanding wardrobes or on hooks. The built-in closet like the one behind me, is a later innovation, believe it or not. Lenox had been a destination for elegant, very wealthy women and men who sought its high mountain breezes in the summer to escape the sweltering heat and the stench of sewage, tanneries, and manure of Boston and New York. The wealthy upper classes had then built what they called, quote, cottages, end quote, massive mansions, all designed to outdo one another in, quote, rustic elegance, along the main avenues. It was here that novelist Edith Wharton summered, quote unquote. I mean, people really used to say, even in my college years, that the descendants of those families still said, "Where do you summer?" as a verb. I'd never heard that before. Believe me, we were not summering anywhere in my family. She summered as a restless young woman trapped in an unhappy marriage to a high-born, mentally unbalanced society husband. And it was here that she expended her extraordinary creative energies on her architectural masterpiece, the massive white Italianate cottage built on a wooden hillside known as the Mount. And here is the Mount and the young Edith Wharton. There's the Mount right there, amazing structure. And there's the young Edith Wharton before she became a famous novelist. I had thrilled to find myself in this environment to which I resonated so deeply. I had fallen happily the night before into the heavy oak four-poster bed. But I understood sadly by late morning as I sat in the living room, leafing through one of the 19th century novels that cleverly lined the bookcases, that the dream I had long harbored was no longer possible. The civilization in which thinking about this era for the rest of my life was an honorable choice no longer existed. The civilizational continuity and confluence that such a life represented was gone. The signs of the destruction of that world, even though lovely structures from it still survived, were everywhere. I had spent the evening before in the harsh new reality that succeeded that elegant world. I had traveled to this part of Massachusetts to appear on a panel with distinguished health freedom warriors. Mary Holland, CEO of the children's health activism organization, Children's Health Defense, which had been founded by RFK Jr., Dr. Adam Urato, a highly rated maternal and fetal medicine doctor from nearby Framingham, Massachusetts, and fertility expert Deborah Sheldon, vice president of the Maha Institute. This historic panel shared devastating facts and evidence that should be shaking the world and dominating global headlines. Mary Holland revealed a collapse in populations and related it to various factors, including toxins in the agriculture environment and in our air. Dr. Urato demonstrated that many pregnant women these days are on an average of 4 prescription medications, and that many cannot wean themselves from their prescribed SSRIs, antidepressant, anti-anxiety medications. He showed graphic images of the corpses of fetal mammals whose growth had been visibly stunted in utero from exposure to SSRIs. His slides also displayed visible damage to neural dendrites caused by SSRI activity in mammalian brains. Dr. Urato noted that the long-term effects of SSRIs taken in pregnancy cannot yet be known. Deborah Sheldon, the VP of the Maha Institute, revealed details of the damage to women's mental and physical well-being, and especially to their cycles, caused by chemical contraception. And I, of course, shared my standard talk summarizing the 360-degree attack on human reproduction, and especially on the bodies of pregnant women and of babies in utero, that my team of 3,500 doctors and scientists under the leadership of my colleague Amy Kelly uncovered in the Pfizer papers. It was stunning to me as I listened to the vitally important and undeniably documented set of presentations by my highly credentialed fellow panelists that this potentially world-altering event was taking place in a tiny town in the peach-walled upper room of the Lenox Community Center and was convened by a small grassroots citizens group, the Berkshire County Resiliency Collaborative, and was being filmed by a single videographer as opposed to having been presented at a packed event convened by ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, thronged by reporters from all the major media. But that emergency and that struggle for proportionate attention to global horrors is the real world now. Other fractures in the lovely imaginary world made themselves visible to me as I looked out at the elegant pines and the slanting sunlight. I realized as I clicked through the history of the inn on the internet that the very building in which I found myself was not what it appeared to be. It was not, in fact, a cozy ancient inn decorated with the antiques of many generations of family ownership. Rather, this too was now an illusion. This 2022 article from the local website Rural Intelligence explained exactly what had actually happened to the building where I sat. The property that had formerly been renamed the Rookwood Inn had gotten scooped up with other historic properties in the area by a pandemic-era conglomerate. Quote, "If the pandemic was good for anything," italics mine, "it must have created a moment in time conducive to buying and selling high-end lodgings. No less than 8 inns have changed hands in Lenox in the past 2 years. 3 of the properties were acquired by 388 Ventures, a New York-based company who partnered with Lifehouse, a hotel software brand and management company. Under Lifehouse's direction, the Rookwood Inn has become the Constance, the Church Street Inn is now the Whitlock, and the Birchwood Inn morphed into the Dewey, all officially opened this spring, period," end quote. I have written about this property grab before in my book, The Bodies of Others. The pandemic, of course, forced tourism to a standstill. Governor Andrew Cuomo forbade big weddings, which had been the bread and butter of the historic inn industry. So in our area, in the Hudson Valley, as well as in the nearby Berkshire Mountains, historic inns and bed and breakfasts had been desperate. Many could no longer survive in private hands with no income at all to offset running costs and maintenance. Thus, dozens were forced into fire sale acquisitions by conglomerates that had formed for just this purpose. You get it? What happened? It's so evil. Conglomerates exactly like the VC company 388 Ventures, which has partnered with, quote, Lifehouse, which for its part is, of course, big tech, which was, as I showed in my book, one of the main drivers of the pandemic narrative, and which industry had wanted to get into new sectors such as healthcare, data, and such as hospitality. And there is the living room in which I was sitting. So I was not sitting in a dream, though it looked like a dream. I was kind of sitting in a nightmare. Lastly, I thought of the young Edith Wharton, how she had looked out over these very streets and sat in interiors exactly like this one as a young woman, and had found the life laid out for her to be so repressive, so limited, that she had escaped it. She had divorced her husband eventually and had fled to Europe and had settled permanently in France by 1910 and had spent the rest of her life living in freedom as a bohemian among bohemians and writing a new world into being. I thought of the decades and decades, indeed, the 135 years of struggle for women's rights that Wharton's life foreshadowed and that her work in turn had helped to launch. And I realized with a shudder how the personal freedoms for which she longed and for which she risked so much, as had the nameless and named women who fought similarly in the century and more that had followed her struggle for freedom, were now again at risk and could be utterly eclipsed in my own lifetime. These rights for women are under attack from CCP-friendly Marxism, stripping liberty from everyone and seeking to, quote, erase gender, end quote, and thus erase women's actual experience altogether. They are under attack, much as I hate to face and name this, from fundamentalist Islam, seeking to overturn norms of liberty in the West. And they are also under attack from the very same interests who profited from the lockdowns and snapped up unique assets such as the Rookwood Inn and digitized their data. They're under attack from the same people who designed the mRNA injection to destroy what was most precious about women themselves. The same people who are now chafing to commodify women's cycles and their pregnancies and their changes of life, to dominate these processes, to control them, to gatekeep them, to market them, big tech and big pharma and biotech. Multiple armies, I felt, from multiple directions, sometimes with converging interests and agendas, were trained on this gracious house and all it represented, and on the ghostly body of the young Edith Wharton and all she represented, on the ghostly lovelinesses of the bodies of Cora Pearl and Skittles, of Lily Langtry and Jenny Jerome, and on my body, whose flesh and blood I felt acutely as I sat on the chicly comfortable muslin-covered couch, and on all of our own living bodies. They are converging on our children's living bodies and on the as yet unborn bodies of their children. So I shuddered. My beautiful world was truly gone. But as a blessing, Brian came in the stately front door. He had driven up from Brooklyn to retrieve me, and he had little Loki on a leash. And Loki was looking around for me, leaping like a puppy and smiling. Loki must have caught my scent. So I laid down the old novel, and I gathered up my computer, and I set out to meet them. And we stepped outside into the frigid contemporary air, back into battle. That is my essay for you today. And what shall we say about it? Gosh, well, tell me your thoughts. I've got lots of thumbs up. I've got lots of people listening. Let's see what other comments there may be. Roscoe is sharing lovely support. Adiambo Osuro is sharing it with a friend. Other people are sharing this. I know that, we all have worlds we gave up or that no longer exist post 2020. And I remember the first couple of years of the pandemic, I thought we would go back to those worlds. They would start up again. We'd pick up where we left off. It's a thumbs up I got about that sentence. Remember that? And then at about the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, I realized they're never going to let us go back to those worlds. We're never going to get to pick up where we left off. They will have irremediately altered them. And it's true. And Roscoe points out it harkens back to the bodies of others era. Sad we're still going through this. It's so true. The world in which I wrote my thesis at Oxford took for granted that freedom of speech and the free exchange of ideas was better than censorship. I mean, my thesis was archivally looking at censorship, certainly warning how easily we could fall into a condition of censorship again in the West. But the Oxford in which I wrote it was an Oxford in which the free exchange of ideas was still structurally built in. I mean, Oxford, has a 1,000-year history of innovating the free exchange of ideas. And there's something about the system itself, which involves like 2 or 3 students with one called Don or professor sitting in the study of the professor talking about the assigned reading, right? You have those tutorials, they're called, as opposed to just Western style big lecture halls. Those exist as well, but the tutorial system is the core and has been for 1,000 years of the, certainly the undergraduate and also graduate experience. And that involves the free exchange of ideas, right? It's an incredibly powerful, intimate, pure way to study a text. Well, the Oxford Union was formed in the 19th century in order to prepare young Oxford students, men, of course, to go into Parliament and to get used to debating across the aisle, or across parties, or debating multiple sides of a subject. And if you go back, there's a wonderful database called Hansard, which it still exists. You can look at it. I think it's free. And it's a private company, but it has all of the debates in Parliament transcribed going back centuries. And it's just beautiful to see this British tradition. I mean, yes, these men in Parliament were, all educated similarly at Rugby or Eton or Winchester public schools, meaning private schools, for aristocratic young men. and they were educated similarly at Oxford and Cambridge. But there's a lot that's beautiful about that. That's not all like evil, that we should tear down in the name of some Marxist egalitarianism, because among the things that they were taught was this, to have to debate a subject from multiple sides. Yes, you could argue they were still debating among aristocratic men who were white, in Parliament. But it is, if you look at the fundamentalism that's engulfing the world and the idiocy of, extremist MAGA, for instance, and extremist left-wing Marxists, that ability to be trained to hold multiple ideas in mind at the same time and consider their merits against each other and their weaknesses against each other is incredibly precious. And the world doesn't look good when you have Islamic fundamentalism saying my way or the highway, or MAGA saying, Christians only, my way or the highway, or leftists saying, Marxists only, my way or the highway, right? It's not good. It's not good for anyone. That was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful ideal. And it allowed Britain to lead the world. Yes, it was an evil colonial power that oppressed people all over the world. I'm sorry, I don't mean to say it like that doesn't matter. Duly noted, everything wanted to be an evil colonial power. No one didn't want to be an evil colonial power like that. That was the nature of history. Everyone was trying to grab land and resources. That being said, Britain also led the world for many centuries as a beacon of freedom, relative freedom and rights of citizens, representation compared with the rest of the world, and also in cultural production. Shakespeare, Milton, Jane Austen, the Brontes, Orwell. I could go on and on. T.H. Lawrence. There's no end to it. And Americans who are talented were drawn to Britain like I was. I trust I'm a talented writer. I didn't want to not go to Britain for my education. That was how I got in touch with and connected myself to this lineage of 1,000 years of a conversation about civilization. Well, we thought that would last forever. But when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, you may know that the horrible leadership of the Oxford Union, the president-elect, had basically cheered violence against Charlie Kirk and almost called for it. And it took international pressure from the alumni of the Oxford Union to have the Oxford Union denounce that position, and I think refuse to install him as the president-elect. I think that did finally happen, but it took literally, outraged alumni around the world putting pressure on the Oxford Union to say, this is not what the union is supposed to be for, calling for violence against people you don't agree with. And I'm horrified that even after that all happened, I thought that would be the end of that, and the union would go back to its tradition of, open debate. I mean, literally, there are two doors in the wall of the Oxford Union. One says aye and one says nay. And after people present in a very structured way the pros and cons of a certain proposition, the students are supposed to walk through one of those two doors, and tabs are kept, and that's how you know who won the debate. So there being multiple points of view that you need to hear out and consider is literally structured into the architecture of the Oxford Union. I've spoken there multiple times. Well, I'll never speak there again unless they, do a big detour, because not only are they calling for violence against speakers of theirs, Charlie Kirk spoke there too, with whom they disagree, which is a very dangerous thing. Why would any speaker ever, who's controversial, ever go to the union to put themselves at the mercy physically of the union? You're housed in a hotel they choose for you. You're given a drink afterwards at the Oxford Union bar if you want, or they have dinners for you. Why would you ever put yourself in jeopardy if the leadership is calling for violence, right? Or aligned with, governments or donors or interest groups that are calling for violence against speakers? They could poison you, and I mean, literally anything could happen. And I thought that was in the past, but Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, president of Israel, who is a peacenik, relatively speaking, who called for a two-state solution, who wanted to have rapprochement with Palestinians, who worked for peace. He was going to speak, and because he's Israeli, uh, they didn't let him speak. And a former Israeli politician, what was he? Former prime minister of Israel. The students didn't let him speak, and then the most chilling image I've ever seen, practically since the 1930s, these, it looks like Muslim students who are in the union holding up bloody red hands, like indicating we're not going to let Olmert speak because he has blood on his hands. But it's also kind of a threat to Jews and Israelis, kind of a threat, holding up bloody hands. In the Oxford Union, these kids do not deserve to be part of these institutions if they do not embrace and uphold the traditions and the structure of free exchange of these institutions. So it's very scary what's happening to Oxford. And I remember thinking, about 10 years ago, gee, this is great. There's so many foreign students here. It's breaking up the old white boys network and the kind of elitist class bound nature of Oxford education. But there is a middle ground, and Oxford did not stop with, livening up the traditions with some inclusiveness and diversity. It's full on a rampage of fundamentalist extremism, where the beautiful values of Oxford, people are scared to even support them, because whose bloody hands are going to be at your throat next, or who's going to be calling for violence against you? It's very, very, very serious. So that too, is something that kind of belongs in this essay, if I were ever to rewrite it, that the world in which I studied to transmit the values and lore and literature of the 19th century, that Oxford world, that world of free speech, of caring about civilizational ideas, caring about diplomacy rather than brute force, exploring multiple points of view, that may not exist anymore. I hope I'm wrong, but it doesn't look like it. And honestly, just judging from my own reaction to seeing these kids hold up their bloody hands, smiling because they silenced a Jew, or they silenced an Israeli, they're not going to hear from the former prime minister of Israel, even though the list of vicious, fascistic dictators that have spoken to the Oxford Union over the decades, that line the walls, is endless, right? As it should be. I mean, the kids should hear from, Russian oligarchs and Pakistani dictators. They should hear from everyone so that they can make up their own minds. But literally dozens of vicious, psychopathic, sadistic tyrants have spoken at the Oxford Union. And Ehud Olmert, former prime minister of Israel, who tried to support policies that respect a two-state solution, bring about peace in the Middle East, they're excited to have silenced him. All right, that's my rant for today. Interesting. Yeah, that's, Roscoe's kind of on a good roll today. I'm going to say that he's right about something. He says, a lot of the artwork promoting the other Naomi's book, that's Naomi Klein, who wrote a whole book claiming that I was her doppelganger, meaning double, which is demented and insane, and, portraying me as a crazy conspiracy theorist. Roscoe noticed something very perceptive. There was a lot of coverage of that book, a lot of promotion of her book while I was being censored in the legacy media and even in the New York Times. And it was very violent and creepy. And they would do creepy things like merging our faces, like photographs of our faces together, as if I'm not an individual with my own biography and existence separate from hers. And that's just stalkery. But and she does that in her book. She doesn't realize where she ends and I begin, or that I have a life independent from her kind of psychotic fixation on me. And also, imagine if a man wrote a whole book about a female public figure and how he was obsessed by, seeing that female public figure as his other, his double. You think this guy needs to be locked up and she needs a restraining order, like don't go within 500 feet of this woman. Anyway, Roscoe's noticing something very true, which was that there was actually violent imagery. There was an image that was very scary to me. In the New York Times op-ed page, they ran an excerpt of her book, and it showed like a wolf, a double of a wolf, my last name is Wolf, being injured or killed with blood. I mean, it showed that someone, and my first husband was an op-ed editor for the New York Times. I know the process, any process, of commissioning artwork like that. It doesn't just show up on the page. The editor has to call up an artist or a graphic designer, describe what they're looking for, describe the general direction, take a look at, 2 or 3 mock-ups that the artist comes up with, choose one. So an editor at the New York Times would have said, we need a bloody wolf. We need an image of a bloody wolf, a wolf that's injured, a wolf that's dying, a wolf that's suffering. Very overt symbolism, not, ambiguous. And again, communication of a threat, I think. So they can, F off, pardon my language. It doesn't make me back off. It makes me double down. Luckily, I'm married to my bodyguard, but it's disgusting and intimidating. And you're totally right, Roscoe, holding up bloody hands. I mean, think how the Jewish students in that room, are they even going to speak? Why would they speak? That's one step from a lynch mob. So there's lots of conversation from Ed West and RCW about Israel and Gaza. I'm happy to have that conversation another time. We've come to the end of our time. I would just say, let's save it, but basically I love a single standard. If you're going to be mad at Israel, be mad at Nigeria, be mad at Iran, right? If you're going to march for Gaza, march for the Christians, 500,000 Christians slaughtered in Nigeria, march for women who are being executed in Iran for not doing gymnastics in hijabs, right? That is really happening, you guys. March for the gay people who are arrested, imprisoned, executed in Muslim countries. March for the women in Afghanistan who are not even allowed to show their faces or go to school. I'm just so sick of the hypocrisy. A and B, it's bad what happened in Gaza. Everyone should obey human rights law. And I don't want to be cruel. And I have suffered to call for, people obeying human rights in Gaza and in Israel. But I do wonder, in this longer conversation, what did Gaza think would happen after October 7th? What is an appropriate response to October 7th? What would we do in America if terrorists came across our southern border and massacred, raped, kidnapped what would be proportionally tens of thousands of Americans? What would we do? I'll leave it at that. Everyone has the right to sovereignty and to defend themselves, including, I'm tired of saying we don't have the right to. We do too. We have the right to sovereignty. We have the right to a country. It should be one of 2 countries, living in peace, side by side, obeying international law. But that's my view. If other people have the right to sovereignty, so do we. And it should be peaceful. It should be according to the rule of law, but also don't fuck with, civilians on either side. Leave civilians alone on either side. I've always been consistent. And, I met my husband because I was getting death threats because I was saying both sides, leave civilians alone. Love you guys. I have to go. Support this podcast. We are actually in the top 100 rankings, many countries around the world, including Russia. So, Nigeria, Argentina, Canada, top 200, I believe. So please support us. We're really making headway. People like liberty. They like discussion, but I need your help. It's expensive to produce these. We have a team. So go ahead and subscribe on Outspoken as a paid subscriber. Subscribe to Daily Clout. Donate if you can't subscribe. Please, if you can, do that. And I want to go ahead and thank our sponsor, which is American Alternative Assets. So if you go to Daily Clout Gold, cloutgold.com, you will be able to get a free report about gold, and you'll be able to see why there are 7 warning signs blinking red about a potential collapse. You've got to diversify, you guys. So cloutgold.com, and our sponsor is American Alternative Assets, and I can't compliment them highly enough. They are a really respectable company that is as good as their word, and we stand by them, and we stand behind them, and we're proud to have them as our sponsors. Take care, everyone, and go check that out. American Alternative Assets, cloutgold.com. Take care. Bye-bye.